how satellite communications can help manage the vaccine supply chain. I'm speaking with Stephen Tompkins, Director of Sector Development for Agriculture and Rail with Inmarsat. Hello, Stephen.
Hi, Robert. How are you?
Good. Thank you very much for being with me today. I really appreciate it. So, Stephen, what role currently are satellite communications playing in the tracking and monitoring of the COVID-19 vaccine?
Yeah, sure. So if we take a step back, I guess satellite's been used through multiple supply chains for many years because it really is the only technology that is available on land, sea, and air. So if you think of a multimodal supply chain, it's a perfect sweet spot for that. So Inmarsat's been involved in tracking of vehicles and supply chain management for many years. We have 14 satellites in geostationary orbit that provide highly reliable coverage across the world. And specifically with relation to COVID vaccines, there are a number of opportunities for looking at enhancing that supply chain. So the key one that comes to mind is obviously ultra cold storage, which is a feature for many of those vaccines that need storage down to minus 70 degrees Celsius in an unbroken cold chain. So the ability for anyone who's managing that chain to be able to get that data from A to B, to know that you have an assured chain that it's always at that temperature, and to trigger the need to change anything if that temperature is being breached is of critical importance. And you need a communications technology that's going to guarantee that that data is always available to you from A to B. And that's really where we're seeing satellite playing a role. It's been used in the cold chain for many years, and it's a direct crossover really for the COVID vaccine.
So what you have, is you have sensors within the containers that actually relay status information to a satellite? Is that correct?
Yeah, typically you will have a number of sensors. So not just for COVID vaccines, but temperature, humidity, any other sensors on the container itself. That's typically then relayed by some form of short range or long range network to what we call a satellite terminal, which essentially just beams it straight up to the satellites. That then goes down to what we call a ground station, of which we've got a few dotted around the world. And then it's sent into the user's smartphone or whatever device they're using to monitor that temperature. And, for the really clever technology, the ability to actually control those temperatures remotely, it simply just works the other way. So the supply chain manager can select the desired variable, hit the button, and it will go via the ground station up to the satellite and down to the container again.
How does it work? Does it issue periodic status reports, or is it exception reporting, only reporting when something goes out of tolerance?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the user's requirement. So it can be either. We see examples where people want it periodically, so maybe every hour, but typically the exception reporting is more useful because you only want to know when a threshold has been exceeded and to be able to do something about it and maybe receive an alert. And that's good for satellite because we keep the bandwidth down. We're only sending really what we need to, which makes it very cost effective.
Mm-hmm. How long does it take? What is the period from the moment that an alert or a message is sent from the vaccine under shipment before it appears on the cell phone of a user?
Yeah, so with our constellation, geostationary satellites, it's got to go 35,000 kilometers up to the satellite and down. So typically you're looking anywhere from just under a second, so 800 milliseconds, to maybe 1.5 seconds for that complete journey.
Yeah. Oh, that long, huh? Unfortunately, it's pretty amazing. What about the reliability of satellite communications with regard to weather events and any other type of potential blockage of signal? Does that happen?
Yeah, it does happen with some constellations, particularly constellations like Ku band or Ka band can be more susceptible to weather events. For these kind of applications, for the IoT style applications, the supply chain applications, we're using a frequency called L band, and that is essentially not susceptible to weather events at all. So we guarantee 99.9% uptime, so that service is always on. And if you think about some of the applications that service is used for, so defense, military, governments, maritime, aviation, control of various systems, whether it's a train or an agricultural vehicle, you have to have that reliability. So it's of critical importance that it's always on. So the L-band really is very suited for these supply chain applications in that regard.
I'm sorry if it sounds like an ignorant question, but if there is a band that does encounter interference, I mean, why would anyone use that at all? Why would not all uses be for the one that's more reliable?
Yeah, so typically for bands like KU or KA band, you're sending higher volumes of data. With KU band, it might be a fixed site, so maybe you've got it in the middle of a field somewhere or on an oil and gas rig, and you're backhauling a lot of data over that, and you need something higher throughput. For these kind of applications, you know, we're talking about very small form factor devices. So we use something called ISAT Data Pro, which is about yay size, quite small. It goes over our satellite. It sends essentially messaging rate data. So it's very small, compact data. So with regard to cold chains, you know, it's generally a single or a number of digits to say what that temperature is at any one time. But we're also using that for alerts for a number of other things. So anything from kind of basic tracking to even when you think of fleets and stuff, is the driver's seatbelt on? Has the vehicle exceeded the desired speed limit, or has there been a crash event? Anything like that. So those very simple packets of data, really.
I see. What are the economics of this technology? How affordable is it versus, so I say, cellular technology or other types of communications?
Yeah, I mean, look, satellites always had this kind of impression that it's very costly, hard to use. You're putting a big dish out in the middle of nowhere, very clunky. You know, what we're talking about here is not that. We're talking about small amounts of data for a start, so the cost is always going to be less because you're not transferring as much. And this technology is very easy to use. It has a low power consumption. Typically, it can be used by non-skilled users and put into various environments quite easily. So whilst the kind of cost per megabyte, if you like, is always going to be more expensive than cellular, that's just the reality of satellite communications. We're really seeing that a lot of these applications are being very careful on the amount of data they're using. We're optimizing that, working with our partners to optimize that. So you're getting down to very affordable rates per month, which you would almost expect on a kind of cellular plan. So it's very viable to use mass scale.
Mm-hmm. Now, you say it's been used before for other types of vaccine shipments and other cold chains, so clearly not something brand new, but I'm just trying to get a sense of to the extent to which it is being embraced and used for supply chain tracking and tracing and monitoring purposes. Is it in wide use today, satellite communications, or is it still kind of in its nascent stage of acceptability?
No, I think it is very widely used. I mean, obviously, you're looking at niche use cases. You're looking at use cases where you don't have cellular communications, so that may be specific geographies or very, you know, hard to reach supply chains. But you know, transport is probably one of our biggest markets on the land side, and would be for some of our competitors as well. And you know, as we speak, we're probably on tens of thousands of vehicles tracking them today through our partners. So, you know, it is widespread, and it has been widespread for a number of years, and the use cases are only growing. And as the technology capabilities expand, I think you're seeing it going from a niche use case to more supply chains that can benefit from that technology.
Seems to me that it would be especially valuable for cargo at sea. In areas far from land, which used to be considered almost black holes of information. But you know, vessels have been engaged in satellite communications for years and years and years. So why not the cargo too? I assume it's being used for that purpose.
Yeah, quite. And you know, vessels is a key use case. I think as well is that, you know, if you've got a multimodal supply chain, you're crossing various different land, sea, and air, and you want something that's always going to work, then that's what people are turning to satellite for, really, for that reliability.
Mm-hmm. Are your satellites considered low orbit satellites at 35,000 feet?
No, so we are a geostationary constellation. So that's 35,000 kilometers above the Earth.
Kilometers, I'm sorry. Hmm.
Yeah, sure. So the advantage of that is that you only need a few satellites to cover the Earth, and you can provide high reliability because that satellite's always going to be there. With the low Earth orbit constellations, they are much lower to the Earth. They
Hmm.
spin much faster around the Earth, and thus, if you're in a supply chain which is moving, you're going to have to hand off to each satellite to go around the Earth. So geostationary is usually used for its reliability for
Hmm.
these low data rate applications in a supply chain sense, where
Yeah.
it's always going to be there and it's going to have coverage at whatever point you are across the world.
Well, I'm quite unclear on the terminology of satellite communications. Are they geosynchronous? In other words, do the same satellites remain overhead at the same point, or do they actually orbit the Earth?
No, that's exactly right. Yeah, geosynchronous, so
I
they
see.
they stay in motion with the Earth.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you have any concern about the proliferation of satellites being launched these days? It just seems like there's tremendous numbers going out there, and there's been, I don't know to what extent we worry about collisions of satellites or getting in each other's way or any communications problems that arise thereof. Are there any concerns along those lines?
I think for us as an operator, because we're at geostationary, there's less of us at that height essentially.
I
So
see.
collisions and things is not a concern for our constellation.
Hmm.
Clearly, there are lots of low Earth orbit constellations coming up, and I know that there are working groups at kind of a public level to look at the whole space junk piece
Yeah.
and all of that stuff going into space. But it's not something that we're overly concerned with, given our height,
That's
basically.
more of a low orbit issue then.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
see. Well, it does sound like your satellites are playing an extremely important role and never more important than in this last year. So I want to thank you, Stephen Tompkins, for taking time to explain the role of satellite communications in vaccine tracking and monitoring. Thanks very much for being with me today. Really appreciate it.
Many thanks, Robert.